The arrival of Corporal Callum Briggs at Forward Operating Base 2, FOB-2, in Quantum was less an assignment and more a subtle disturbance in the chaotic symphony of MACV-SOG. He didn't arrive with a fanfare of brass or the usual bureaucratic paper trail. He materialized. A lone chopper deposited him near the perimeter wire one humid afternoon, and he walked towards the ready team, RT Florida Hooch, carrying only a minimal pack and his rifle. Briggs was, officially, on a temporary lend-lease from the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, a detail that raised more questions than answers. Captain Hayes, the RT Florida commander, squinted at the thin memo from headquarters. It offered zero operational justification, just a cryptic note authorizing the exchange of one seasoned long-range reconnaissance specialist for an indeterminate period. "A bloody phantom transfer," muttered Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the team's designated M60 gunner. "What is this, a foreign exchange student program?" Hayes, a man who survived by trusting his gut more than official documents, watched the new arrival carefully. Briggs was tall and lean, moving with a predatory economy of motion. His eyes, the color of a stormy Tasman sea, swept over the camp without focusing on anything specific, yet registering everything. He never smiled. His primary personal equipment seemed to be a polished, well-used Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, always prominently sheathed across his chest. The initial reception was frosty. The SOG men, a motley crew of hard-bitten veterans who had perfected a brash, loud style of jungle warfare, viewed Briggs' quiet intensity as arrogance. He didn't participate in the customary post-mission debrief banter, didn't share his rations, and offered only curt monosyllabic responses to questions. "Hey mate, you actually got a voice under that hat?" cracked Lieutenant Davies one evening. Briggs looked up from meticulously cleaning his rifle. "If it needs saying, I'll say it." This lack of camaraderie grated on the Americans. They relied on noise and aggression, on overwhelming force and a swaggering presence. Briggs operated on the opposite principle: stealth, silence, and absolute absence. He moved through the camp like a shadow, often disappearing from sight only to reappear moments later exactly where he was needed. But the discomfort slowly gave way to grudging curiosity. They noticed the way he checked the perimeter tripwires not by sight but by feeling the ground. They observed how he could sit motionless for hours, seeming to melt into the jungle foliage, breathing so shallowly he seemed dead. Briggs wasn't just a soldier, he was a relic, a man who had perfected the art of hunting and surviving in the primeval darkness. Captain Hayes's initial apprehension turned into an acute, almost desperate realization. Callum Briggs was a weapon they didn't even know they needed. He was not a Special Forces operator, not in the American sense. He was a tracker, a ghost, a professional predator who carried the cold, unforgiving philosophy of the Australian outback into the lush inferno of Southeast Asia. "Forget the paperwork," Hayes told Rodriguez that night. "That Aussie isn't here for a temporary assignment. He's here because we've been playing too loud, and he's the silence we need to survive." Briggs, meanwhile, went to sleep under the starlight, his mind already mapping the enemy infiltration routes around the base. He had arrived without ceremony, and he intended to operate without permission. The first mission with Corporal Briggs, codenamed Operation Nightingale, was meant to be a straightforward reconnaissance insertion along the Laotian border, the infamous tri-border area. RT Florida's objective was to confirm an intelligence report concerning a PAVN heavy logistics depot. They were a six-man team, and Briggs, much to the annoyance of Sergeant Rodriguez, was designated point. The insertion was clean, but the silence felt wrong. Too absolute. After 3 hours of movement, the team had covered perhaps a kilometer, Briggs moving at a snail's pace that infuriated the pace-oriented SOG veterans. "We need to move, mate," Rodriguez hissed over the radio using the lowest setting. Briggs's voice, when it came, was a dry whisper. "We're already where they want us to be." Moments later, the jungle erupted. It wasn't a typical ambush of sustained fire. It was a carefully planned, tight operation. The air crackled with the sharp reports of AK-47s mixed with the sickening thud of incoming mortar fire. A string of fragmentation grenades detonated, followed by the terrifying click-hiss of 3 hidden Claymore mines arming nearby. They had walked directly into a kill zone designed to wipe out the entire unit instantly. Captain Hayes shouted orders, trying desperately to find cover for his men, but the trap was too tight. Panic was setting in, compounded by the knowledge that the mines were about to blow. Then, Briggs moved. He didn't fire a single shot. He dropped his rifle and, ignoring the incoming tracers, darted toward the point of maximum danger, where the claymores were positioned. Using the momentary distraction of the mortar shells, he crawled under the deadly wire, pulling out his webbing belt. The SOG men, pinned down and paralyzed by the unfolding horror, could only watch. Briggs used the belt to secure the tripwires to the base of a small tree root, effectively disarming the pressure plates without triggering the explosives. As the nearest PAVN patrol moved in to exploit the confusion, expecting the Americans to be pinned or mutilated, Briggs snatched up a discarded M79 grenade launcher and fired a round not at the enemy, but far to their left, creating a sudden, loud diversion. "Follow my six," Briggs snapped, his first genuine command, his voice razor-sharp and devoid of emotion. He then led the team not back the way they came, nor directly forward, but into a dense, waterlogged mangrove swamp flanking the main trail, a path that no map, American or VC, would mark as viable. It was a suffocating, insect-ridden hellscape that forced them to move belly down through thick mud, but it was silent. The American team followed, sputtering, covered in muck, yet alive. The enemy kept searching the ridge they had just left. After a brutal 45 minutes, they emerged onto a solid patch of ground, completely clear of the patrol. Rodriguez, shivering and covered in leeches, stared at Briggs, who was already rechecking the action on his rifle. How did you know that swamp was there? That wasn't on the map." Briggs merely wiped mud from his knife. "The water runs that way. Where there is water, there is always a way through." Captain Hayes didn't scold his men for their panic. He had nearly lost control himself. He looked at the Australian, covered in mud but radiating cold control. He realized Briggs hadn't just saved them. He had orchestrated their escape using a blend of impossible calm and intimate knowledge of the terrain. "He's not a soldier," Hayes whispered to Lieutenant Davies, his voice tight. "That Aussie is a two-legged weapon, designed only for existence. He doesn't fight. He survives, and we were just collateral in his survival plan." The near-death experience on Operation Nightingale fundamentally shifted the dynamics within RT Florida. The initial resentment toward Briggs dissolved, replaced by a deep, unsettling respect. Captain Hayes knew his men were the best the U.S. had, but they had just witnessed a level of bushcraft that transcended mere special forces training. Briggs never held a formal class. His training was subtle, constant, and delivered through silent demonstration. During their patrol movements, the SOG men were used to watching their compasses and their point man. Briggs taught them to read the jungle like a book. He showed them that the dew point on the leaves at dawn wasn't random. A slightly less intense layer of condensation on the forest floor meant something. A recent passage, a heavy footfall, or a path used consistently by the enemy before sunrise. He taught them to track by the angle of the sun filtering through the canopy and the subtle shift in the air temperature, skills that seemed closer to a native tracker than a modern soldier. His most profound lesson centered on breath. The American doctrine emphasized silence, but Briggs demanded absence. "You breathe too deep," he'd state plainly, not as an instruction but a fact. "You pull the air, you move the moisture, the sound travels, you are announcing yourselves." He demonstrated the technique, showing them how to breathe so shallowly, mostly through the nose, while lying prone, that he could remain perfectly still in the thick undergrowth, seemingly melding with the moss and mud. He called it breathing like the dead, and the skill essential for surviving hours in a compromised position. Rodriguez, the burly machine gunner, initially struggled, finding it unnatural and painful. But after Briggs corrected his posture once, a single, sharp tap on his diaphragm, Rodriguez achieved a sustained, almost unnoticeable state of stillness. The turning point came when they stumbled upon fresh tracks. Intelligence suggested a small, transient VC camp was nearby, possibly a resupply cache. Hayes was preparing a flanking maneuver, gathering the team's heavy firepower. Briggs stopped him with a single hand gesture. He pointed to the faint drag marks on a route. "They're complacent. Camp is close. Too many guards will hear the patrol move." He then executed what the team later called the unarmed infiltration. Stripping down to his trousers, boots, and vest, taking only his fighting knife and a small spool of comms wire, Briggs slipped into the bush. He took zero radio support, operating completely alone. The SOG team watched the clock tick by, their nerves fraying. They were ready to rush in and cover him when 2 hours later Briggs reappeared just as silently as he had left, stepping over the same route they were observing. He walked up to Hayes, his eyes holding the same icy calm, and placed 2 items on the ground: a surprisingly detailed VC hand-drawn map of the local supply trails, and a small, innocuous brass bell, the type used to alert camp guards to movement on the perimeter wire. "They use the bell near the stream," Briggs explained, his voice low. "I removed it, now they think their ears are playing tricks." Hayes stared from the map to the silent bell, then back to Briggs. The Australian hadn't fired a shot, hadn't raised an alarm, and had successfully penetrated a functioning enemy camp. He had demonstrated without a word that the greatest skill in the jungle was not brute force, but the mastery of invisibility. The team, humbled and awestruck, knew they were no longer dealing with a temporary liaison. They were students of a master. Upon RT Florida's return to FOB-2, the routine mission debrief was anything but routine. Captain Hayes bypassed the standard operational reports and went straight to his secure radio setup, requesting a private encrypted channel with the highest echelon of MACV-SOG command. He didn't just report on the depot location or the enemy's complacency. He focused entirely on Corporal Briggs. "Sir, this is Hayes. Regarding the Australian asset, Briggs, my formal recommendation is that we initiate steps for a permanent retention." There was a pregnant pause on the line. "Permanent, Captain? He's on temporary loan. We're talking international exchange protocol here." "Protocol is killing men, sir," Hayes countered, his voice firm. "Since Briggs arrived, RT Florida's mission effectiveness has jumped 50%. And our risk exposure has plummeted. He doesn't just scout the perimeter, he removes the threat. He's trained my team in techniques that render us virtually invisible. He is, simply put, the difference between mission success and a body bag retrieval operation." Hayes then detailed the Claymore disarming incident and the solo, unarmed infiltration, ensuring to emphasize the zero casualty rate achieved solely because of Briggs' preternatural caution. His request was bold. He proposed a complex bureaucratic maneuver extending the temporary status indefinitely, citing critical and unique operational requirements essential for upcoming deeply classified missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Hayes's bold report eventually filtered back through the convoluted military channels to the Australian liaison offices. The response, however, was strangely ambiguous. There was no immediate rejection, no sharp demand for Briggs's immediate return, only a series of non-committal radio messages. "Acknowledged. Briggs's status remains under review pending evaluation of operational impact. Continue current assignment." The silence from the Australian side was not hostile. It was a peculiar form of tacit approval. It hinted at a secret understanding. Perhaps the SASR knew exactly what Briggs was capable of, and viewed his assignment with SOG as a kind of high-stakes, real-world deployment where he could hone his craft far from administrative scrutiny. In the camp, the issue of Briggs' stay was an open secret. Hayes handled the logistics. He ensured Briggs always had the best gear, the sharpest blades, and the quietest quarters. Meanwhile, Briggs himself remained utterly detached from the politics surrounding him. He never asked about the status of his papers, never inquired about his return date, and never seemed to care about the shifting command structure. To him, the mission was continuous. He woke up, trained, prepared his gear, and waited for the next movement order. He accepted the assignments given by Captain Hayes as if the SOG was his unit of origin all along. His loyalties were not to a flag or a memo, but to the mission and the men who relied on his silent expertise. His indifference only deepened the mystery and, paradoxically, the trust. The SOG men realized that Callum Briggs wasn't motivated by promotions or rotation dates. He was motivated by the sheer, cold imperative of survival. And if he felt he was most effective, most alive, with RT Florida in the remote jungles, then that's where he would stay. The temporary assignment had, in the eyes of the operators, already become a firm and highly valuable permanent fixture. The true crucible of Callum Briggs' value came during the extraction phase of a mission deep inside Laos. RT Florida had successfully tagged a major PFN fuel cache, but during the hasty retreat, specialist Mac McIntyre, the team's radio operator, went down hard, twisting his ankle badly. In the chaotic, thick jungle, the team had been forced to leave him behind briefly, intending to circle back once they shook off the immediate pursuit. The immediate situation was desperate. McIntyre was alone, wounded, and stranded in a known North Vietnamese Army PAVN tracking sector. Compounding the tragedy, a massive buildup of anti-aircraft weapons, likely SAM sites in the sector, meant that no air support, no rescue helicopter, no gunship cover could safely enter the zone. Captain Hayes was faced with an impossible dilemma: risk the entire remaining team in a suicide rush back, or accept the loss of one man. "We can't leave, Mac," Rodriguez insisted, his face pale with adrenaline and fear. "We can't go back," Hayes countered, pointing to the enemy tracker symbols on his map overlay. "They'll be pouring into that sector within the hour. It's a sweep and clear operation for them now." Briggs, who had been silent, cleaning the mud off his boots, finally spoke. His voice was flat, final. "I'll go." Hayes looked at him, startled. "Briggs, that's a deep penetration. You'll be alone against heavy pursuit. You go in, you might not come out." "If you send the team, you lose the team," Briggs stated, bundling a medical kit and 2 canteens of water into his vest. He took no assault rifle, opting instead for his silenced Car-15 submachine gun, for emergencies only, his razor-sharp fighting knife, and a length of comms wire. He was reverting to his truest form, the silent hunter. He disappeared into the twilight. The next 36 hours were an agony of waiting for RT Florida. They could hear the distant, muffled sound of heavy enemy patrols sweeping the sector where Mac was last seen, but there was no sign of Briggs. They monitored their radios for the worst, a short, desperate firefight, or perhaps just silence. Meanwhile, Briggs was weaving through the jungle like smoke. He avoided every well-worn trail, moving exclusively through the thickest, most impenetrable undergrowth, using his dead man's breathing technique to hide during the daylight hours when PAV patrols were most active. He wasn't tracking McIntyre, he was tracking the trackers, staying just ahead of the enemy's pursuit curve. He found McIntyre huddled beneath a root system, delirious from fever and dehydration. The young radio operator was amazed to see not a full patrol, but one lone, silent figure materializing from the shadows. The return journey was the true test. Briggs didn't have the strength to carry Mac and avoid all contact, so he had to neutralize threats. Using his comms wire as a garrote and his knife as a surgeon's tool, he executed a series of surgical, silent, close-quarter eliminations on two separate two-man patrol teams that came too close. He did not fire a single shot. He eliminated the threats, wiped the blades clean, and continued moving. After 36 hours and 15 minutes, a gaunt, exhausted Callum Briggs walked into the designated extraction point. He was covered in mud, his eyes bloodshot but perfectly composed. Slung over his back, securely tied with emergency webbing, was the shivering, grateful figure of Mac McIntyre. Hayes rushed forward, his face etched with relief. "Briggs, you mad son of a bitch, how many contacts?" Briggs simply adjusted his vest. 3. Eliminated. The others are searching the opposite sector. We can lift now. The team looked at the two items he placed on the ground, the brass knuckles he had used to quiet one guard, and the familiar, unblemished Fairbairn Sykes knife. Briggs had proven that in the ultimate test of survival and extraction, invisibility was the most effective weapon of all. The successful, miraculous extraction of Specialist McIntyre marked the final, irreversible turning point for RT Florida. Briggs was no longer merely a temporary asset. He was the unit's talisman, their unspoken guarantor of survival. The men had witnessed the purest form of special operations capability, the ability to achieve an objective without leaving a trace or firing a costly shot. The change in the unit was profound and systemic. Captain Hayes began subtly but fundamentally revising RT Florida's operational doctrine, moving away from the aggressive, direct action style typical of American SOG teams toward the austere, stealth-first philosophy demonstrated by Briggs. The most noticeable change was in their movement. The characteristic heavy, fast-paced ranger's stride of the Americans vanished. It was replaced by the low-impact, deliberate, toe-to-heel shuffle that Briggs used, designed to disperse weight and minimize soil compression. Radio chatter, once a constant low-level noise, was cut to the barest minimum, a nod to Briggs' belief that the enemy's ears are sharper than your coding. Even their personal gear changed. The clunky, noisy equipment gave way to lighter, silent loads. More men began carrying secondary Fairbairn Sykes knives or local equivalents, placing greater emphasis on close, silent work rather than relying solely on the overwhelming firepower of the M16. Sergeant Rodriguez, the loudest and most skeptical man initially, became Briggs' most fervent disciple. He started studying the movements of local wildlife, spending hours attempting to replicate the shallow, dead man's breathing technique. He found himself looking not at the trail ahead, but at the subtle patterns in the disturbed leaf litter, exactly as Briggs had taught. Callum Briggs, however, never sought credit, never gave a formal lecture, and never acknowledged his influence. His training continued through quiet correction, a pointing finger to a snapped twig, a soft cough to indicate a misplaced step, or the silent presentation of a perfectly tied non-slip knot. The legend grew quickly, spreading through the clandestine network of SOG outposts. Other ready teams began hearing whispers of Hayes' unit, a team that had suddenly become unnervingly quiet and lethally efficient. They were no longer known as RT Florida. They earned a chilling new moniker, the Shadow Team. The stories attributed to Briggs became hyperbolic myths within the tight-knit community. He can smell a tripwire. He knows the VC patrol schedule by the sound of the frogs. He is the ghost the NVA cannot track. Hayes himself internalized the SS methodology. He understood that Briggs wasn't just a skilled soldier. He represented a different ideology of war, one where the goal was not to engage and destroy, but to observe, report, and disappear. Hayes summarized the transformation to his lieutenant. "We used to rely on our helicopters and our brass. Now, we rely on silence and a goddamn knife." Briggs gave SOG something it never knew it lacked, its own dark shadow. When we move, we are simply following the shadow he casts. The reality was, SOG had adapted. They had absorbed the cold, precise lethality of the Australian SASR, and having tasted this new, terrifying effectiveness, Captain Hayes was absolutely determined that the loan of Corporal Callum Briggs would never, under any circumstances, be repaid. The inevitable arrived during the monsoon season. A low-priority encrypted message slipped into Captain Hayes's secure file. It was a formal order from the Australian High Command, filtered through the U.S. Military Assistance Command. Subject, termination of secondment, Corporal Briggs, C. The message was curt and administrative. Corporal Callum Briggs' tour of duty supporting MACV-SOG had officially expired, and he was to be rotated back to his parent unit for debriefing and reassignment. The operational impact clause that Hayes had previously relied on had been overridden. The phantom loan was being called in. Hayes stared at the paper, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Briggs was more than a soldier. He was the keystone of RT Florida's current success. Losing him now felt like losing their eyes and their silence in the deepest parts of the trail. He immediately brought the issue before his remaining men. The reaction was not resigned acceptance, it was outright fury. "They can't take the Aussie," insisted Mac McIntyre, the man whose life Briggs had personally saved. "He knows this sector better than any of us. If we run the upcoming insertion without him, we're blind." Sergeant Rodriguez, his face grim, voiced the collective sentiment. "Captain, we're a better unit because of him. If they pull him now, it's not just a personnel change, it's a death warrant for the next team that hits the border." In an act of audacious defiance, Captain Hayes instructed his lieutenant to draft a collective, non-official letter of protest. Every man in RT Florida, from the lieutenant to the newest medic, signed the document, listing every major success, every life saved, and every enemy threat neutralized only because of Briggs's silent proficiency. The tone was unprecedentedly insubordinate for an official report, arguing that Briggs was critically non-expendable to the war effort in the tri-border region. Hayes then pulled Briggs aside, out of earshot of the main hooch, finally addressing the subject of his departure directly. "Briggs, the paperwork came through. You're being recalled to Australia. They want you back within the week." Briggs typically showed no reaction. He simply nodded and began sharpening his primary knife. "Understood, Captain." Hayes was surprised by the lack of emotion. "Don't you have anything to say? A complaint? A request for extension?" Briggs looked up, his cold eyes connecting with Hayes's. "My orders are clear. If I'm to be elsewhere, then I will be elsewhere. The mission ends when the assignment ends." "No," Hayes said, leaning closer, his voice low and intense. "The mission ends when we decide it ends. Look, they're not sending an extraction team to pick you up. They expect you to travel through the logistics chain." Hayes paused, lowering his voice to an absolute whisper. This was the moment of ultimate commitment, the offer of insubordination born of respect. "If the Australians don't dispatch someone specific to collect you, we will facilitate your disappearance. I will falsify your discharge papers, assign you a new name, something simple like Smith, and hide you in the firebase until the war is over. You will be declared MIA, and you can live out the rest of this war as RT Florida's own shadow. No one here will talk. We need you to survive." The intensity of the offer, a path to become a literal ghost of the war, permanently adopted by SOG, was immense. Briggs merely continued sharpening his steel, the soft shing-shing of the whetstone the only sound. He didn't agree, but crucially, he didn't refuse. He was waiting for the final move. The final act of Corporal Callum Briggs's service with MACV-SOG was executed with the same methodical, absolute silence that defined his tenure. A week after the recall order arrived and Captain Hayes made his desperate offer, the fate of Briggs was decided not by a high-ranking officer, but by the absence of one. No specific Australian SAS personnel arrived at FOB2 to personally escort their operative home. Headquarters had simply scheduled him for a standard transfer flight out of Da Nang, leaving the logistics of his final departure to the American Base Command. Hayes, waiting anxiously for the signal from the Australians, felt a surge of defiant hope. He had the falsified papers ready, the quiet corner of the bunker prepped, and the entire team sworn to secrecy. Briggs could become Smith tonight. But Briggs made his own choice without consultation. He knew Hayes was willing to commit career suicide to keep him. He knew the desperate need of the men who had become his strange, loud American family. Yet Briggs understood that to accept the clandestine offer would mean tethering Hayes to a crippling secret and staining the unit with unnecessary risk. His purpose was to reduce risk, not create it. On a rainy Tuesday night, when the monsoon rain hammered the corrugated iron roof of the hooches, drowning out all other sound, Callum Briggs simply packed his meager kit. He left the expensive American equipment he had been issued, the newer radio, the heavy assault pack, and took only his original worn webbing, his rifle, and his polished fighting knife. He didn't seek out Captain Hayes. He didn't shake hands with Rodriguez or McIntyre. There were no farewells, no speeches, and no promises to write. He merely walked out the main gate, informing the sleepy guard that he was catching a lift to the logistics depot. He left the way he had arrived, a ghost walking between the raindrops. By morning, when his bunk was discovered empty and his paperwork found neatly stacked on Hayes's desk, the men of RT Florida understood he hadn't accepted the fate of a deserter or a ghost. He had chosen the path of the professional soldier, departing silently to protect the men who had protected him. A week later, sitting alone in the heavy silence of the command bunker, Captain Hayes found himself looking at the freshly painted wooden wall. Briggs had left a mark, not a signature, but a final, indelible piece of instruction, a stark reminder of his philosophy, scratched with the tip of a bullet into the green paint. When you don't hear footsteps, that's Briggs. The phrase became the unit's unofficial motto, recited to every new replacement who arrived at the perpetually quiet RT Florida hooch. Briggs was gone, but his methods lived on, the gold standard for survival. Years later, long after the unit was disbanded and long after the war had ended, veterans of MACV-SOG would trade stories, lowering their voices when they spoke of the legendary Australian. He was the anomaly, the phantom man they had borrowed, the greatest asset they had ever deployed, and the one man they had desperately, collectively decided they never wanted to pay back. But the ghost of the Australian SAS, true to his creed, paid the debt himself, with his silence ensuring their legend and his own would endure.